Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Incredible Hulk, the animated series, not to be confused with any number of Incredible Hulk things at this point. We ultimately have it to where ultimately we've had Incredible Hulk, the live action Bill Bixby show. We've had The Incredible Hulk, the movie. And so I'm ultimately doing The Incredible Hulk, the animated series, which ultimately is to be seen on Disney Plus. So hopefully that clears any kind of confusion for anything like that. I hope that I'm going to make it abundantly clear on the thumbnail and everything that it's the animated series, not the live action Incredible Hulk or the Incredible Hulk movie, just to clear that up. Because I don't know how many times I'd probably just say, like, yeah, this is Incredible Hulk. Like, I'm definitely letting everybody know it's Incredible Hulk. And yeah, anyways. So, going into this, so I had seen the first 9 episodes of this series. I know 9 is an odd number to end off of. Why not just 210? I don't know. I just like this is what I just got to. So ultimately, I just man, let's just see the first 9 episodes of this and just enjoy the bizarre adventure that these episodes tend to go into. Because when looking at it, I don't know how many times that I've seen the Hulk just having to be buried under rubble and having to Hulk his way out, or reasonably at a lot of times we end up having Hulk being attacked by Thunderbolt Ross and him having to take down some robot forces, or eventually we have it to where seemingly there is a portion of Shield in here, which I didn't realize that there was a portion of Shield in here. I've never seen this animated thing in my life, so ultimately I'm not coming from a source of memory or anything like that. This is like first time watching a lot of these episodes, and so everything is just kind of like brand new to me. I didn't catch this originally or whenever it originally incarnated from originally. Uh, I was actually really surprised by otherwise all the people that they ended up having appear on the show. Like I was kind of really surprised by like having Ghost Rider like really early in this show. Like I was really surprised about some of the characters that I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's supposedly that person. Like I remember that character. I know this person." Like I think there was some characters that were probably honestly probably tied onto this show because one to probably help people like say, oh well, maybe there should do this kind of spin-off, maybe we should have this kind of show, maybe we should have a Ghost Rider animated series, maybe we should ultimately realize that, oh, this show is going on, and so on and so forth, and any number of things. And plus there's also probably any number of these characters that were otherwise doing some kind of show somewhere, and so ultimately why not throw them in here. So talking very cryptically, of course. But I actually really liked the route of which they kind of went into this show, because when really looking at it, you're going to need some special guests on this show because reasonably it's just going to be the same old rinse and repeat of Thor ultimately going in and fighting the same people over and over and over again, and basically that's kind of still what it does kind of go into in this series. Like it's basically just Hulk going into every single episode having to bash some kind of Thunderbolt or Shield robots of sorts, and then eventually it's like, okay, let's get to the story of this episode. We ultimately have it to where, like, I guess Bruce Banner is kind of on the run, but when really looking at it, like him being on the run isn't doesn't exactly feel like he's stealthy or secretive or whatever. Like he's basically running into the one place that ultimately we'll get people to just be like, oh yeah, Bruce Banner, he's in there. Okay, let's go and get him. Like that ultimately is seemingly every episode so far. Um, I don't think really to me that the leader persona with his so says the leader kind of persona thing, I don't think that that is really wearing thin. Some people might be annoyed by the leader ultimately having this same quote every single episode. Uh, and so reasonably, I'm really just enjoying the leader whenever we get some time with it. I just think that reasonably we have it to where the main leader or the main villain has no real tying into every single episode. It just kind of feels like the leader is a lot of times just playing a lot of stuff out. Just see, like, hey, let's just put this character out there, just see what happens. Like, it doesn't really seem like the leader has a lot of tie in to everything. It's just kind of like, oh, well, the leader is checking on to see what's going on with Bruce. But I don't know. It's kind of a little thin in that department. But anyways, so I really just I enjoyed the odd episodes because when looking at it, it's like you're kind of seeing a very unique approach. You're kind of seeing ultimately just monster on monster. It's kind of fun. It kind of like reminds me of like old fashioned approaches and old fashioned monster movies where it just be like, okay, big monster guy against big monster guy, and that's all that it needed to be. So ultimately, let's go into spoilers. Because ultimately, we got 9 episodes going through. Basically, a lot of these episodes are pretty straightforward. So even when I go into spoilers, hopefully I don't mix and mangle everything together. Because when looking at it, it's a lot of the same stuff almost over and over and over again. Like rinse and kind of repeat in some episodes. We have Rick Jones, who's ultimately voiced by Luke Perry, which I thought was really awesome. It's like, oh, isn't that great? Like, I'm really looking at that guy's Rolodex and seeing that ultimately he was otherwise tied to this show. I'm like, good for him. Luckily, he got this job because I don't know how many numerous people would probably ultimately just be like, yeah, like, luckily I got to voice this person in this show. Because it's like probably when looking at it, it's probably like the highlight of their career. Even when really looking at it, it's just like who knows. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So ultimately, in the first episode, really, it's just the origins of Hulk, really, and really, it's just tying itself to really just Thunderbolt Ross, and otherwise, uh, trying to. The consistent theme here is Hulk is trying to cure himself by any means, but when eventually that means cure, ultimately it means that Hulk is just going to Hulk out and destroy a bunch of things. That's normally what happens. So we ultimately have it to where Hulk is trying to cure himself because he calls himself, I'm such a horrifying, freakish monster. Ultimately, when he's having his tape recorder, he's like, my freakish monster ability that I have, I need to get rid of it. Man, do we have Bruce such an emotional person, like in these episodes. Like that's the thing that I think I can just enjoy about this show so much is really just the Bruce moments where he's really going full on, just like really immensely self-deprecating upon himself about how he's just a horrific, monsterish freak or whatever he ends up saying for that episode. And then eventually we have it to where like we'll get into some more interesting moments where like we're tying in Bruce and other people. And it's kind of interesting. So we end up having it to where Bruce ends up going and trying to cure himself, but of course, that goes horribly awry, and that justifiably ends up just accelerating Bruce to become Hulk. So we end up having it to where ultimately in this very first episode, we're just here to really kind of showcase who is Betty, who is Thunderbolt Ross. We ultimately have it to where ultimately in this first episode, we really have it to where Thunderbolt is Ross is just trying to send some mechs and some machines and stuff like that, and just the army and whoever out to just take this thing down. But it ain't gonna happen that way. Uh, we ultimately have it to where Betty is seemingly the consistent thing that is ultimately going to consistently have Hulk change back into Bruce. It seems that ultimately Betty is there to pull off the hey Hulk, the sun's getting really low kind of maneuver. To ultimately we have it to where Hulk changes uh, into Bruce yet again. We ultimately have it to where, like, and I thought it was really bizarre. There was one point that ultimately Bruce was ultimately looking at a picture of Betty at one point in one of these episodes. And the picture of Betty, I think, had her as a like a brown haired character, or like a brunette, or a redheaded character, I think. And ultimately, Betty throughout this entire series has always been blonde. Was it a different Betty? Was it? I don't know. I didn't get that. I didn't get that whole picture. Did somebody whoever did the imagery for that cartoon for that episode, did they not realize that Betty was blonde that whole time? I don't know. Must have been some random new guy that ultimately, when looking back on it, they saw the defect in that episode. Maybe they fired him. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they were just like, nah, nobody's gonna notice it. It's on screen for like 2 to 5 seconds, but I noticed it. So going on. So we have it to where this episode is really just okay. Like Bruce is or Hulk is going on a rampage. Betty's there to calm him down. We ultimately get to know a little bit about Thunderbolt Ross, and eventually within these first two episodes, we eventually get to find out a little bit about this guy Talbot, who is ultimately orchestrating some of the stuff that Thunderbolt Ross couldn't be bothered to do. So we end up having it to where in these first two episodes, it's really just to kind of like have us be like showcasing that Hulk is consistently trying to cure himself, and eventually he is to be otherwise cured basically by Betty temporarily from the whole hulking out thing. And really, that is what these two first episodes really are, to be brutally honest. We're consistently having it to where Betty is consistently going out on the field to try to calm Hulk out from being Bruce and so on and so forth. Or Betty is to calm Hulk to become Bruce, and that's consistently what happens. In the second episode, we eventually have it to where the leader ends up going and unleashing Abomination onto the Hulk, and we get this awesome duking out moment between these two characters. And I was like, well, that kind of setting the landscape of ultimately the most iconic battle between Abomination and Hulk, because when looking at it, if you ever see Hulk in any other cartoon, most of the time we end up having it to where Abomination is realistically uh, Hulk's main nemesis for most of those cartoons, until you probably get to like the Hulk Smash cartoon, where ultimately I think Abomination is Hulk's ally and becomes kind of a more prominent member of the uh, that Hulk team. So really, that's just the first two episodes, kind of banging those up, because there's not much going on in those episodes. There's some introductions of Gabriel from Shield and whatever. So that is to happen eventually. So we are somewhere in these episodes. I don't know. There's so many things that just kind of get muddled and whatever through any number of these episodes. So we have it to where in this third episode we end up having it to where it seems that consistently Bruce is to cause at some points his villains of these episodes, and we ultimately have it to where Hulk is to uh, go on and to of course do his usual damage of sorts, and we end up having it to where Hulk ends up turning back into Bruce, and Bruce ends up meeting this guy named Mitch. And we end up having it to where Bruce is going to Mitch, ultimately asking him, hey, like, if ultimately I can just borrow your lab to ultimately do some experiments and ultimately try to fix myself. Um, we ultimately have it to where eventually Mitch ends up going and becoming this Zap-ish like character, this character that ultimately is led to be fused with electricity to become some electrical Hulk like presence. And but we ultimately have it to where Mitch, like Hulk, kind of can go from being Mitch to this Zap-ish like character. So we have some interesting moments where we have it to where Hulk ends up trying to figure out how to exactly defeat this Zap-ish like character, kind of throwing metal items or fencing stuff to ultimately have Zap kind of be like stuck um, uh, metallically wise into basically environments that ultimately will otherwise Zap's power. So we end up having it to where ultimately there's a big fight out at this dam via the end of this episode. And we ultimately have it to where ultimately the main way that ultimately Hulk takes Zap down is to basically just dunk him in water. And that resolves this whole Zap character. And we are to assess or assume that Zap will never come back again. And like I was like, okay, this is a bizarre way to just resolve this character's ultimately just like we have this like fight out a little bit. It kind of gets interesting, kind of like this back and forth tossing of like Zeus lightning bolts with Zap, and Hulk is countering by throwing like metal pieces at Zap and so on and so forth. But eventually we have it to where Hulk eventually takes Zap and just dunks him into the water, and ultimately that resolves everything. We are supposed to be led to believe. So moving on, I am just blazing through these episodes because some of them are good. Like these early ones, I'm like, they're kind of rough. But then again, ultimately, people can enjoy some of them. Like I think in episode 2, there are some interesting like giant sized uh, like snakes and stuff like that that ultimately kind of get in the mix with episode 2. We ultimately have it to where uh, Thunderbolt Ross was like experimenting on weapons to use against the Hulk at some point, and but ultimately, like in episode 2 especially, we eventually have it to where Hulk ends up getting stuck in this like cave like environment, and ultimately we have it to where a bunch of people are tossing rocks off to the side to ultimately try and help out Hulk. And like I was like, God, every episode to follow after that, we end up having Hulk getting stuck somehow in some rock rubble for any number of these episodes. Like especially even an episode we'll talk about later. So episode 4, ultimately we otherwise have to tie in some Avengers or some other characters that Hulk is known to be tied with. And so in episode 4, we end up having it to where we are to tie in Iron Man to this story. So we are ending up having it to where ultimately Rick Jones is going to make his way to see War Machine, which I'm like, okay, this is a really interesting, like, dipping way back in the past to ultimately see this War Machine and this Iron Man in this series just looks really fascinating to me. Like, I was like, man, look how chintzy their armor looks. Look how goofy that they look. Whatever. It's just whatever. Anyways, so we end up having it to where Rick Jones ends up going and seeking the help of War Machine and Iron Man. And so eventually we have it to where ultimately Iron Man has to basically tie himself onto uh, Tony Stark has to go and rescue Hulk to be able to try and experiment on him and ultimately try to help. What they end up doing is they end up trying to suck the gamma off of Bruce Banner, but it doesn't exactly work. Um, and really, the entire episode is eventually uh, also Banner trying to get his memory back because he doesn't remember things. Um, and so ultimately, we have it to where Rick Jones needs to desperately ask for for Iron Man's help because ultimately it seems that Hulk had gone and had some temporary amnesia to where he doesn't remember anybody, and we end up having it to where in this episode that eventually we have it to where Hulk needs to get his memory back with the help of Tony, and because ultimately Hulk ends up attacking Tony, but then ultimately eventually Hulk realizes that these are his friends, and so ultimately we have it to where Banner tries to uh, ultimately come to and then ultimately go and uh, be experimented on by Tony, which ultimately doesn't work anyways. So, moving on to the next episode. I honestly think out of these 9 episodes, I honestly think episode 5 is just my favorite episode. Like, I love Ghost Rider. I'm always won over by Ghost Rider. I don't care how cheesy this Ghost Rider looks. I really just enjoy this episode just because Ghost Rider is in it. Um, I know reasonably it feels like an odd, bizarre choice to probably put Ghost Rider in here, but when looking at it, Ghost Rider is powerful enough uh, to go up against the Hulk. So I guess it makes more sense than any other character that normally would be in the mix. So we seemingly ultimately have it to where there is a nun that is ultimately going and she is praying, of course, per usual. And we eventually have it to where ultimately Hulk is to, uh, as per usual, cause a ruckus and ultimately cause some destruction into a building. We ultimately have it to where Hulk is to ultimately try and rescue seemingly this nun, but eventually we have it to where seemingly that uh, Johnny Blaze ultimately turns into Ghost Rider because he is to assess that. Well, I don't think we never confirmed that it is actually Johnny Blaze in this one, but meh, whatever. So it kind of looks like Danny Ketch's Ghost Rider thing, but I'm not sure. So we end up having it to where Johnny Blaze ends up coming to the evade of this nun, and ultimately Johnny Blaze ends up rescuing this nun from this church or from this building, and we eventually have it to where that Ghost Rider and Hulk are going to have a fight out, because we end up having it to where Ghost Rider is really upset that Hulk is basically spilling the blood of the innocent by recently having it to where like he's going through buildings and knocking them all down, and he doesn't even realize all the damage that he's doing to any number of people. So we end up having it to where eventually Rick Jones is to get in the way of Ghost Rider and ultimately uh, tell Ghost Rider, it's like, hey, like, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't know Hulk like I know Hulk. Like, if anything, Hulk is very misunderstood, and recently what you're doing here, you're trying to get at Hulk. That is completely and utterly wrong. We ultimately have it to where seemingly that Rick Jones is otherwise touching onto the Ghost Rider's motorcycle, and Ghost Rider is noticing. It's like, oh, hey, it looks like that your hands aren't burning up because ultimately, I guess you are pure of heart or something like that. So we end up having it to where Ghost Rider and Rick Jones, I think his name is, go onto the same motorcycle together and drive off to go and meet Hulk. So we end up finding out that seemingly that Hulk is eventually going to get attacked, uh, and ultimately to seemingly get hit with something that is ultimately, if he turns back to Bruce, is going to poison and or kill him. Because ultimately we have it to where the drug amounts aren't exactly the exact same between Bruce and Hulk. So we end up having it to where ultimately that everybody now needs to rally around and make Hulk consistently um, consistently angry because they need to wear out this adrenaline. We ultimately have it to where Doc Samson is otherwise tied to this task force of trying to take out the Hulk. But we end up having it to where Doc Samson realizes, is like, dude, there's no way we can take this guy out. Like, there's no way we're going to be able to take him out. There's no way. We ultimately have it to where Doc Samson is forcibly, like, tied to the Hulk Buster task force, and we end up having it to where Doc Samson's looking at Betty like, what the heck? What did I sign up for? Like, what am I doing here? Like, we have it to where Doc Samson is like, dude, I didn't come here to take orders. Like, look at my hair. Look at my long flowing hair. Like, do I look like a soldier to you? Like, I'm not a guy that's gonna take orders from anybody. Nah, I didn't come here for that. But so we end up having it to where Doc Samson, light bolt and all, tries to go out and subdue this Hulk with ultimately, seemingly some robotic members of sorts, to try and drug Hulk. But then the mixture of drugs just doesn't quite uh, work all that well with Bruce and with Hulk. So ultimately, they have to keep uh, giving Hulk seemingly shots of adrenaline by just making him angry. To where ultimately they can wear out the drugs, so ultimately they can kind of give an even keel amount to wear out Hulk. To where ultimately he just slowly but surely evens the drug amount out, so ultimately he can just turn back into Bruce and everything be completely okay. So it was kind of interesting. I really like Doc Samson, but I think they never really used him enough. And then I also just really enjoyed Ghost Rider in this episode. I think that's the thing that kind of won me over in this episode. Was really just to have both Ghost Rider and Doc Samson. Just because I think Doc Samson is a character that I think they really don't use nearly enough uh, in a lot of Hulk stories. And when I'm always kind of skimming through and trying to find like a Hulk story, I immediately just go like, "Hey, is Doc Samson gonna be in this one?" No, doesn't look like it. Mother, I like Doc Samson. I think he's an interesting character, which I, again, don't think they use nearly enough. So ultimately, we move on. So we have it to where in the next episode that Bruce ends up deciding to go on into going to Canada. So we end up having it to where seemingly we have this very interesting moment in the very beginning of this where we end up having like Bruce seemingly who I believed had like unhulked out and had just been like consistently like freezing his butt off because he had no shirt on. It was just shorts and of course he's in like the dead of cold. And so we end up having it to ultimately Bruce Banner is otherwise relying on heavily being in touch with Dr. Walter Lenkowski, who I believe ultimately becomes Sasquatch in this episode. Ultimately, if you guys may be familiar with Alpha Flight, that's what I'm assuming is this character that ultimately Bruce is going to be commingling with in this episode. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately Bruce is to end up going through this seemingly Canadian icy and or cold environment, and eventually we have it to where Bruce is just consistently walking along, and ultimately realizing that he needs to keep on moving, or otherwise he's just gonna pass out, or he's gonna freeze to death, or whatever. So we end up having Bruce mosey along, and eventually we have it to where Bruce ends up falling into the ice, like falling into a hole, and then so he's forcibly, like basically in icy waters, and he is trying to dip his head into any ice hole that he can find, and then ultimately he's just dragged back into the water because the current is repetitiously pushing him back into the water. So we end up having it to where forcibly uh, Bruce is to become the Hulk to stay alive, and eventually we have it to where Hulk just smashes through the ice, and then ultimately we have it to where Hulk eventually makes his way through here. So we eventually have it to where ultimately Bruce is to eventually meet this Dr. Walter Lenkowski, and we eventually find out that similarly this doctor had been experimenting on gamma rays as well. Because it seems like this doctor had wanted to use small amount of gamma rays to be able to fix something as simple as like no longer needing glasses anymore. But the only problem is that ultimately this transformation ultimately turned this guy into a big old Sasquatchish like monster. Like to me, like when looking at Sasquatch, I'm like, dude, this guy looks exactly like Wendigo. Like if you look at like Sasquatch and you look at Wendigo, it looks like the exact same freaking thing. It looks like somebody just like if you look at God, what is it? If you look at episode 10 and you look at episode 6, like it looks like the exact same thing, like basically, like as if like they basically took the exact same design. Because ultimately, I believe um, in episode 10, I think that's where they end up having Bruce probably fight the Wendigo. But anyways, I didn't see that episode. I'll get to it eventually. But I was like, yeah, this looks just like the Wendigo. Like when I've seen Marvel Comics, like I've seen a Wendigo, and I'm like, it looks the exact same freaking thing. Like, I don't know. But anyway, so we end up having these two behemoths, if I have to say that, uh, duke it out, fight it out. We ultimately have it to where eventually that we end up having it to where this doctor ends up going and wanting to, I think, siphon off Hulk's strength and stuff like that. But eventually, we have it to where they end up doing this experiment, and we end up having to where Hulk turns and then just breaks this environment that he is in, his experimental pod thing, and also so does Sasquatch turn and break out of his pod thing as well, and ultimately they just battle it out. So basically, it's just a battle of the battle of the battle. It's basically just a bunch of battling um, going on in this episode. Um, and reasonably, that is all of what really just happens in this episode. I think at some points there is a point where the leader is just kind of looking over things and whatever is per usual. But that's probably about it really going on in this episode. Um, yeah, moving on. So, if ultimately I wasn't kind of intrigued or impressed by like Sasquatch from Alpha Flight, which I don't even know if that is. I'm hoping I'm saying these things right, but then again, so I could be wrong about anything. Maybe it's Dan Ketch who's Ghost Rider in this episode. Maybe it's Robbie Reyes. I don't know. It's Johnny Blaze. It has to be. So going on into episode 7, I was like, wow, they're really going at this. Like, and the funny thing is 7 doesn't commingle with episode 8, and I was so baffled about that. I'm like, what's going on with that? You would think you would have um episode 8 and then 7, but then again you would have problems with the way of which that things go about in 7 and 8. But anyways, moving on. So episode 7, we ultimately have it to where seemingly Hulk is to make his way back to the States. It seems that eventually we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Banner is homesick, I guess. He doesn't even say that in this episode, but I just feel that he's homesick, connectively homesick. So we eventually have it to where Bruce is to go and find his cousin. His cousin. Ultimately, everybody knows where this story is going immediately. It's like, oh, where's the blood transfusion going to happen? How's it all gonna break down? When is it all gonna? Because as soon as you say the word cousin, for any part of any superhero show, immediately it's like, oh, well, his cousin is going to become some superpowered thing because Supergirl and this character. So we end up having it to ultimately Bruce is to go to Washington. We ultimately have it to where Bruce is to see Jennifer Walters. So we end up having it to where ultimately we see this Jennifer Walters that seemingly has this like really like two-piece workout outfit consistently on. But ultimately she's to say that she's a lawyer, which I don't really buy that at all. I don't really buy that at all. It looks like this girl is like some supermodel of sorts. But anyways, so we end up having it to where Bruce and Jennifer are to be driving off, and we end up having it to where there seems to be some Doom robotic mechanism bots of sorts, Doom bots, that ultimately go and try to seemingly attack Bruce while he's driving this vehicle, and this vehicle ends up going off, and we end up having a big, huge car accident, which ultimately turns Bruce into the Hulk while he's driving, and we end up having it to where Hulk eventually goes and destroys these robots, but then turns back into normal Bruce to ultimately get to his cousin. So we seemingly end up having it to where ultimately Doom is wanting a little piece of that Hulk pie, and all while this is going on, we ultimately have it uh, to where also the leader is just kind of poking his head on this and just kind of looking like, Doom's gonna want a piece of this. So we end up having it to where eventually that Doom is to kidnap ultimately Hulk's cousin and ultimately to try to get control of Hulk. And so ultimately we end up finding out that Jennifer is in worse for wears. To ultimately, Hulk has to, of course, act fast and ultimately talk about a transfusion. And so ultimately, he ends up transfusing his blood with Jennifer's to ultimately change her into She Hulk. So we end up having it to where ultimately that Doom is not quite a match for both She-Hulk and Hulk. So what do you think normally happens within this instance? Doom ends up losing. We end up having it to where seemingly She-Hulk like permanently changes into She-Hulk. It's not that she changes back from Jennifer. No, she's just seemingly permanently She-Hulk. We end up having it to where like she really sticks out compared to Hulk, and so on and so forth, which leads to eventually the next episode. Um, I really thought it was kind of fun to just kind of see like Doom just appear in in episode 7, and then I was like okay, like this is just kind of weird to just have just Doom pop in here. But I thought it was also weird to have kind of someone else pop into another episode, which I'll talk about here shortly. So, and I'm kind of just rushing through a lot of these. So on the next episode, we end up having it to where ultimately we run into the Thing, bizarrely. So, because we end up finding out that seemingly a lot of the other Fantastic Four are seemingly on vacation, and ultimately we are ending up having it to where Banner is desperately wanting to speak with Reed Richards, so ultimately he could do another experiment on himself, but it seems that Reed is ultimately away. So we seemingly end up having it to where Rick Jones ends up bumping into the Thing, and it seems that there is some um, circus characters of sorts that are ultimately going and throwing some shade on to reasonably the Thing. We end up finding out that it seems like uh, they're putting the Thing in a cage and ultimately like throwing bananas on him. We ultimately have some ogreish looking girl that ultimately is going and attacking Ben Grimm, but Ben Grimm doesn't want to supposedly hit a woman, so ultimately we have it to where this girl is kind of just dominating Grimm. We ultimately have it to where ultimately Rick Jones uh, ends up falling into a gator part of this like zoo esh like carnival, and so Ben ends up having to tie this woman up with a metal bar of sorts, and ending up jumping into this water to ultimately try and save Rick Jones. So we eventually have it to where Rick ends up trying to swim away. Eventually, we end up having it to where ultimately um, Hulk and She Hulk are to basically come to the aid of the Thing, and we kind of mix all these people together. So we end up for this entire episode just basically having it to where really there is not a lot going on in this episode. You'd think there'd be a lot more going on, but there actually isn't. So we ultimately have this kind of like connection between um, like Ben and She Hulk. We end up having it to where She Hulk is really throwing herself at Ben Grimm, and Ben Grimm doesn't want anything to do with it. we end up having it to ultimately that really a lot of this is just to cement that eventually She-Hulk is going to end up with the Fantastic Four at some point, and really that is all of what really is to very much go on into this episode. So, going on into the very last episode. So, we ultimately find that it seems that the gamma rays had created some gamma virus that is spilling around. So, we ultimately have it to where it seems like uh, there is some quarantining going on. We end up having Betty ends up try to get her way to to help out through location of Detroit, and we end up having it to where ultimately we have uh, bizarrely in this episode we end up having Thor in this episode, but it is a Thor that ultimately turns into a guy that turns into Thor with a stick. I'm like, you know what? I remember this in some kind of old fashioned like approach of Thor where we end up having a common guy ending up turning into Thor with some kind of stick. And I was like, this is so bizarre. Like every time that I would see this in some old fashioned cartoon, I would never understand it in my life. Like I would be like, okay, why is it that this guy is turning into Thor bizarrely? Um, I never quite understood that because I'm just so used to seeing just a Thor arrive from Asgard, and I never quite understood the whole stick and other guy that it was like you have it to where like basically this turns into like the Etrigan kind of DC's Etrigan kind of gimmick where we ultimately have Jason Blood who turns into Etrigan, and then we have a guy that's like rhyming 80 bajillion times, and that's the thing I never quite got about the early things of Thor. So we end up having it to ultimately uh, we end up having to, or forcibly, Bruce has to tie himself onto the gargoyle-ish or the the little minion of the leader. We end up having it to where this little minion guy ends up turning into seemingly a normal-looking person, but the only problem is he is turning back into normal, but he is also dying at the same time. So we end up having it to where seemingly that everybody's getting infected with this gamma virus, and we end up having it to where Bruce is saying like, you know what I'm realizing, like I could ultimately take this virus and I could ultimately cure myself, but there's only a certain amount of it to ultimately help so many others and help myself. So I don't know what to do. So we end up having a tour, of course, that Bruce ends up going and helping all others instead of going and curing himself. And really, that is what is to go on mostly with this episode. We end up having a tour, of course, that Hulk ends up fighting Thor in this episode, but really a bulk of all of this is really just going and figuring out this whole virus thing, going through this whole quarantine like thing and stuff along those lines, and eventually having Bruce ending up tying himself with the leader's minion, seemingly because it's a means to an ends kind of thing to ultimately help everyone. So that is really what happens in this last episode. I kind of rushed through a lot of these episodes, but when looking at it, I don't know how ultimately people will enjoy any of these reviews or something like that. So when really looking at it, I just kind of really rushed through this one compared to any of the others. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.